All right, kiddos, so we're going to talk about the word populations a lot today. And the reason we talk about that word so much is because evolution occurs at the population level. So there's individuals, right, of a species that live in a specific, or they make up a specific population. And natural selection acts on the individuals in the species. And if natural selection acts on the individuals of the species over a long period of time and changes the alleles or the genes or the traits that you see in that population, then we call that evolution. So if you look here, let me get my laser pointer. Evolution in a population occurs when the genetic makeup of that population changes over time due to a change in the population's environment. Okay, so the environment changes, the individuals in the population have to adapt, and so natural selection acts on those individuals, and then of course the population will change over time. So what is a population? When you're talking about populations in terms of evolution, it has a very specific definition, and that definition is all of the members of one species that live in a common area whose population dynamics are different from those of other populations. So if we look here, it's all of the members of one species, so we're not talking about different species, okay, we're talking about one species that live in a common area and whose populations are different from those of a different population. The one thing all of the organisms have in an individual population is that they all share a gene pool, right? So individuals within one population share a gene pool, which are all the genes and all the members of a population. So if you look, we have a bear here. This is a black bear. It's Ursus americanus. It's one species of bear. It's called a black bear. And there are populations of black bears, throughout the country. There's a population of black bears here in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. There's a population of black bears in Michigan. There's a population of black bears in Florida. There's a population of black bears in Maine. There are many different populations of black bears, but they are separated geographically. They can be separated by mountain ranges, rivers, other species that are of different, other populations of a different species can be separated by water, by islands. So if you're talking about the same species, they just happen to live in a different area, okay, geographically, then they are different populations of the same species, okay? So what we have, and you can see if I circle it, we have a population of black bear that lives here in Tennessee. There's a population of black bears in Florida. There's a population of black bears in northeastern Pennsylvania, northwest New Jersey. There's a population of black bears in Michigan, in Maine, in New York. And so those bears, although they are the same species, right, they are different populations. Now, the reason I keep saying that is because evolution takes place at the level of the population. Individual organisms do not evolve. So this individual bear, if its environment changes, is not going to evolve. It's going to adapt, right? Natural selection may act on that individual bear, but only populations as a whole evolve. Populations evolve over time as allele frequencies change within a population. All right, so right now what I'm going to do is tell you a story, and the story is in your lesson. It's actually in lesson 2.02. It's in the Explore section, and if you click on Explore here and then click through to page 4, this is where the story starts. Okay, this is a fictional story about real things that can happen within a population. So here we go. I'm right here. It says, let's explore a population of one species. We'll use a fictional case that is based on real events and real processes from natural history. This fictional story is about a population of tropical birds. Up until about 100 years ago, the tiny make-believe Pacific island of Beagle, Make-Believe Island, had dense forests teeming with beautifully colored tropical birds. No natural predators existed on the island for the birds, and they lived peacefully for hundreds, if not thousands, of generations. One of the birds was the arc-crested fruit dove. Again, not a real bird, we're just making up a story to illustrate real processes that can occur. a colorful bird you can see at right. The fruit dove population on Beagle Island at that time had a large number of individual birds. The gene pool of the population was made up of all of the alleles of all of the genes from the whole population of fruit doves. So there was a population of these doves that lived on this fictional island. All right. So while all arc-crested fruit doves had the same basic feather color scheme, there were differences between the individuals. For the trait of crest feather color, variation existed in this population of fruit doves. For the purpose of this fictional example, suppose some individuals had a crest with bright purple feathers. Now the crest is the feathers on the top of the head, right? Individuals had a crest with bright purple feathers while others had green crests. There is a gene for color for head feathers, and from your study of genetics, you know that there are 2 alleles, right, for that gene. The capital F is dominant for purple crests, and the lowercase f is recessive, so lowercase f birds had green crests. For simplicity's sake, say that the ratio of the 2 alleles was 1:1 for the entire population. So the birds could either have purple crests or green crests. So then, okay, to make this story interesting, this snake gets introduced to this island. Who knows why? We're going to make up a story. We're going to say that maybe the snake arrived on ships coming to the island in the early 1900s. Again, this is a fictional story, right? So this snake arrives on the island, and interestingly enough, the snake has a better time seeing the purple-crested birds than it can the green-crested birds. Now, this snake likes to eat lizards, and it also likes to eat birds. If it can see the purple birds more easily, it's more likely to eat the purple birds. And if it's more likely to eat the purple-crested birds, those birds are not going to live long enough to reproduce. And if they are not living long enough to reproduce, then they're not going to be able to pass on the trait of the purple feathers on their head. The green-crested birds, they camouflage better, right? They blend in with the leaves on the trees better. And so the snake is less likely to eat these. Because the snake is not eating the green-crested birds, they're living long enough to reproduce, and if they're reproducing, they're passing on that green-crested trait. And so you can see originally the allele for green versus the allele for purple, they existed in a 1:1 ratio before the snakes arrived. You can see we're at about 25,000 alleles for green, 25,000 alleles for purple. But after the snake arrives, you can see over time how that allele for the purple feathers declines and the allele for the green feathers increases as time goes by, because the snake is eating the purple feathered birds. If it's eating the purple feathered birds, they're not living long enough to reproduce, and so they're not able to pass on that purple gene. Now the gene stays in the population, it's just not as frequent, and so you're not going to see as many of those purple birds. So this is an example of natural selection acting on individuals, right? Survival of the fittest. In this case, natural selection is selecting for the green-crested bird and against the purple-crested bird. Okay, yes, I know the snake wants the purple-crested birds. That's the one it can see. But natural selection itself, we would be saying that it's selecting for the green-crested birds, so they get to keep reproducing and passing on that trait, and natural selection is selecting against the purple-crested bird. They're getting eaten, and so they're not passing on that trait. Okay, so this is another example, but this is a real-life example of natural selection acting on individuals within the population. So changes in the environment, of course, can lead to changes in a population. In England during the 1800s, most peppered moths were light gray with a few dark spots. Many years later, most peppered moths were almost completely black. During that time, England was experiencing the Industrial Revolution. Large amounts of soot were released into the environment and darkened the bark of once light-colored trees. These were the same trees that peppered moths rested on during the day. So you can see this is a this is tree bark, and there are two moths on it. There's a light colored moth that looks like it's peppered, like it's had pepper sprinkled on it, and this is a dark colored moth. They're the same species. The tree, though, the bark of the tree used to look like this little spot right up here. See how it's kind of light and peppery, just like this moth. So before the bark turned dark, the bark looked like this moth, and so the moth was able to land on the tree and rest there during the day, and the birds couldn't see it, and so the birds couldn't eat it, right, because it was camouflaged in. But eventually, during the Industrial Revolution in the early to mid-1800s, right, lots of factories were built, and in order to power a factory, you have to burn coal, and coal is dirty. Well, it's a lot dirtier then than it is now. It's a little bit cleaner now to burn coal. But it used to produce soot, and all this black soot would get spewed into the atmosphere, and when the soot would settle, it would settle on everything on the ground, and it would settle on the barks of the trees. So the tree bark, which used to be light, now becomes darker. Well, that didn't really work out well for the light colored moths, right? Because originally the light colored moth could land on the tree, it could rest there all day, and it was camouflaged when the tree bark was light, but the tree bark got darker, and so this moth was no longer camouflaged. But there was variation within the population. Not all the moths looked exactly like this one. Sometimes the moths would be born with that darker trait. And so as the bark got darker and darker, the moths that were darker actually ended up camouflaging better. And so eventually over time, the darker moths weren't being eaten because they were now camouflaged better, and the lighter moths started getting eaten. So this is an example of natural selection selecting against the light colored moth and for the dark colored moth. The birds would eat the light colored one, and so if the birds were eating the light colored moths, those moths were not living long enough to reproduce, so therefore they couldn't pass on that light colored trait. The trait doesn't totally disappear from the population, you're just going to see it less and less. And so as the bark stayed dark, the dark colored moths are better able to blend in, they're not getting eaten, and so therefore they're able to live long enough to reproduce and continue to pass on that dark colored trait. Now, interestingly enough, the opposite starts to happen as we realize how dirty it is to burn coal, and as all this black soot is being spewed into the atmosphere over the course of, passing through the Industrial Revolution and then moving on and learning how to clean up our burning of coal. The factories start producing less and less soot. And so if less and less soot starts to fall on the bark of the tree bark can go back to being its normal color, which was lighter, like this splotch up here. And so you see a shift back toward the lighter colored moths over time because the soot disappears, it stops settling on the bark goes back to its normal lighter color, and so now the lighter color moths do better, they're not getting eaten, and so they're living long enough to reproduce and pass on that lighter colored trait. So the example of the peppered moths during the Industrial Revolution is a great example, and it's a real example of how natural selection acted on the individuals, right? Originally it selected against the light colored moths and for the dark colored moth on the dark colored bark, right? So natural selection acted on the individuals within the population, and over time the population evolved. The dark color trait increased while the frequency of the light colored trait decreased at the height of the Industrial Revolution. So we talk about genetic variation in a population. Any species within its population is going to have variation. You saw in the moths, there were dark colored moths and light colored moths. Same species, but they have genetic variation. You'll see variation in the human population. Our hair color, our eye color, skin color, height, whether you can sing or not, whether you can run fast or not, whether, those things are all part of our DNA, and there's variation. You can see it in every individual. And even in those birds, the fictitious birds, right? Some of them had purple crests and some of them had green crests. So genetic variation is what natural selection acts on, right? So it's those differences, it's those variations in a population and the individuals of a population that natural selection can act on, can select for or against. So natural selection acts on variation in populations. So what exactly is genetic variation? It's the diversity in a population, the gene or allele diversity in a population. Evolution comes from natural selection acting on genetic variation, and genetic variation can be caused by mutation, gene flow, and genetic recombination. So we're going to talk about all three of these things. Okay, so mutations first. Remember, natural selection acts on genetic variation. Genetic variation can come from these three things. So let's talk about mutation first. What's a mutation? A mutation is a spontaneous change in an organism's DNA structure or sequence. There are 4 different kinds mentioned in your lesson, and I also have a video for you that describes some different kinds of mutations, but there are point mutations, deletions, translocations, and inversions. You are responsible for going into your lesson. I think we're in lesson 2.3 at this point, for reading about these 4 different types of mutation. I can show you real quick though, if you go to lesson 203 and you click on Learn, and you click on this first Explore section. Be careful when you're reading lesson 203. There's actually 2 meat and potato sections, so make sure you read both of these. But if you click on that first Explore section and you click through to, I might have the wrong, no I don't. If you click through to page 5 and then click on genetic mutation, it shows you a quick list and demonstration of the different kinds of mutations. So you can click on point mutations and it'll show you what happens, deletions, and translocation. You just click the play button, wait a few seconds, and it will actually show you what happens to the gene sequence in those different types of mutations. But there are more than just those types of mutations, obviously. So make sure you read through the entire lesson, and there's also an Amoeba Sisters video on the announcement page that will help you learn more about mutations. Now, what's cool about mutations is that they can be helpful, harmful, or neutral. Most mutations are neutral. They don't help or harm a population, but there are some that can be harmful, and the Amoeba Sisters video touches more on those, like causing cancer or disease. I thought this was interesting, that all people on Earth are born with approximately 300 mutations in their DNA that make their DNA distinctly different than their parents. So that genetic variation is being introduced all the time. It's not something that happens once in a while. Genetic variation is being introduced into a population regularly, okay, through mutation, genetic recombination, or gene flow. So the next one we're going to talk about is gene flow. That would be right here on our concept map. And this bear, right, is a carrier of genetic information. That's what it does. And this bear, let's say it lives in Tennessee, the bear population in Tennessee can actually get to the bear population in Pennsylvania, because all of this is connected by the Appalachian Mountain chain, which runs right through these states here. So it is reasonable that a bear that is born in the Tennessee population could migrate, make its way to the Pennsylvania population. And when it does, it's literally bringing its genes with it. Now remember, these are 2 separate populations, and so their gene pool is a little bit different. And so this bear can bring some of its genes right into that Pennsylvania bear population. So when an individual moves from one population to a new population, it brings its alleles along with it, introducing new alleles into the gene pool. The introduction of new genes into a population when new organisms move in is called gene flow. This bear is literally, right, taking genes, alleles, and bringing them to Pennsylvania. So there is a flow of genes from this Tennessee population into the Pennsylvania population. And let's move on to genetic recombination. Again, natural selection can act on the genetic variation of individuals through mutation, gene flow, and genetic recombination. This happens every time a cell goes through mitosis. We have homologous chromosomes. So here's chromosomes from dad, chromosome from mom, right? They're homologous. They code for the same genes. Before the cell pulls apart, right, before we get to the cell, the chromosomes migrating to different sides of the cell, the homologous chromosomes will cross over. They literally look like they're holding hands. And they literally cross over and they exchange genes. And you can see this exchange of the genes here in this picture. And so that is called genetic recombination, and it's another example of how genetic variation is introduced into a population so that natural selection can act on it. All right, there can actually also be a loss of genetic variation, and we know that's called genetic drift. Genetic drift is a very specific kind of loss of genetic variation, and it's usually really quick and it's really random. Genetic drift can also add genetic variation into a population, but it's more, the term genetic drift is usually used with a loss of genetic variation. It can go both ways. There could be a loss or a gain, but typically we use the term genetic drift when we're talking about a loss of genetic variation, especially when that loss happens randomly and quickly. And so I love this example. It's so cute. This is not for the worms, I guess. These are worms. There are brown worms and green worms, and they live on the dirt. And all of a sudden, this elephant comes along and steps on like most of the green worms right here. And so instead of there being like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 green worms, now there's only 5 green worms, and so you have that loss of the green allele in the population. And so it's instead of increasing genetic variation here, we're decreasing it because we've lost some of the green worms who could pass on that green trait. So genetic drift is a term that we use when we're typically discussing the quick random loss of genes in a small population. So that's genetic drift. All right, so natural selection. This kind of sums up everything that we've been talking about. Natural selection, of course, is the process in which the natural environment acts on individuals so that those with favorable traits survive long enough to reproduce and pass on those favorable traits, and those that do not have favorable traits are eliminated from the population. They don't live long enough to reproduce, and so those unfavorable traits don't get passed on. Natural selection acts on variation in populations, and it is the mechanism for evolution. Evolution operates at the level of the population. Natural selection, however, occurs at the level of the individual. Populations evolve, but individuals either survive and reproduce or they do not. Put a little star next to this. Evolution operates at the level of the population. Individuals don't evolve. They can change, they can adapt, but as a whole, it's the population that evolves because natural selection is acting on the individuals.